Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature, an insider's look at living in the Arctic, presented by Annie Van Dinther. Annie is NatHab's Guide Development Director and has been leading trips for us since 1999. It's a pleasure to have you with us today, Annie. I'm going to hand things off to you.
Thank you so much, Kendall. Appreciate all that you're doing to make these happen. Hello, everybody. It's nice to see you. I'm going to present all by myself today. I usually have someone join me because it's so fun to have someone else join me with these stories. But today I thought I would come and tell a little bit of a personal experience and what it's like to be living here, actually in the subarctic. But I'm darn close to the Arctic, and I have spent quite a bit of time in the Arctic. So we're going to kind of unpackage that and look at what that is. The first thing we're going to talk about is just defining what the Arctic is. And some of this is from what we talked about last week. We did get some questions and some thoughts regarding this, so I want to bring it up a little bit and then we'll get into it more deeply. The Arctic is defined by the Greeks. This word came from the Greeks as the bear, okay? So I want to talk a little bit about what this means from a few different directions. The Great Bear. Let's talk about Antarctica for a minute before we get to the Arctic. The Arctic is this water surrounded by land. Antarctica is land surrounded by water. But there's a really important point here that I just wanted to make sure we got from last week. That means that Antarctic or Antarctica means not bear. So just to clarify, the penguins in the not bear place are in Antarctica, and in the Arctic, we've got the bears. So I just want to make sure that was really clear from last week. Now, let's talk about the Arctic or the subarctic. When my kids go to camp in Michigan, which is where I'm originally from, there's a question that they often get asked if they say to people that they live in Alaska, and that is, do you live in an igloo? There's all kinds of perceptions about what the North is, what the Arctic is. Sometimes you might think about boots, right? There's just this perception we have of boots. In fact, this is my friend Lindsay's boots, and in fact, I call her Boots. She's one of our bus drivers in Churchill, and maybe you've had the pleasure of having her on a trip. Maybe you think about dogs, you think about sled dogs. That's certainly something that I think of when I think of the Arctic. This is one of my little favorites. Maybe you think about caribou, or this time of year, reindeer, right? And that could be something that just brings up images of the Arctic. Polar bears, of course. Who does not think about polar bears when they think about the Arctic? These fierce, huge animals that are often referred to as the kings of the Arctic. And queens. Let's remember the queens. Come on. Or lynx. This is another animal here in the north that often we think of. I have seen lynx here a few times. They're definitely one of the most elusive. One of my favorites, if you have been on a trip with me, you know that I'm a little bit obsessed with the Arctic hare. Look at this guy. Looks like he's going to say a little prayer that he hopes that his winter goes well. Certainly, if you are a hare in the Arctic, that's a reasonable prayer because you're definitely food for something. The Northern Lights. This is iconic, right? This is something that you're definitely going to think of when you're imagining the Arctic. Speaking of which, go ahead and check out what's happening with the aurora right now. If you know about the auroral forecast, I would go on to the University of Alaska at Fairbanks website. There's a whole bunch of websites you can check out, but there's a lot of geomagnetic activity happening right now. They say that there might even be lights that you could see all the way down to Ohio. So you don't have to be here in the subarctic or in the Arctic in order to even see the lights this week. So please check that out for the next few nights. This picture was taken by my good friend Corbin Hawkins. I do need to give him credit for that. Maybe when you think about the Arctic, you think of the people. You think of Inuit, or you think of Eskimo. And yes, that is a word that could still be used in some places. In fact, here in Alaska, there are different groups that prefer the word Eskimo. They come from tribes and groups that would be considered, I don't know if I'd use the word warring anymore, but historically warring with Inuit groups, and so they would prefer the word Eskimo. Inuit is, of course, the word that we would use. I would say that I certainly do think of people when I think of the Arctic, especially indigenous people, and I think about how they survived before we had the walls that I have around me here, and the lights and the heat and all the things that make it easier. I think of my friend Murdered Mule, and if you have been to Churchill with us, you think of the stories and the art that she created. I think of her coming to Churchill years and years ago, and how that was a big city for her and what she did to survive in that area. I think of latitude, and for a lot of people, latitude is what defines the Arctic, right? Anything above 66 degrees north is in some ways a strict definition. This is a photo of a reindeer, and I will say reindeer because this was taken in, I'm gonna try to say it, guys, Svalbard. Can never say it quite right, but this was from Spitsbergen. You can see this is 77.8750 degrees north, incredibly far north, certainly by latitude as the definition. This was in the Arctic. This photo, again, look at the latitude there, was taken in Kaktovik. So these are polar bears from the north coast of Alaska. Where polar bears live, is that a ways that we could define the Arctic? Look at the latitude here in Churchill, 58 degrees north, below the Arctic Circle, which again is 66 degrees north, so quite far below the Arctic Circle. And here we have polar bears from Churchill. And where I live, Homer, Alaska, north of Churchill, and looking very different. Look at all those trees. It is not at all similar to Churchill in terms of looking like the subarctic. Homer looks like a forest. We have in some areas almost like a temperate rainforest. But in terms of daylight, it does seem that way. This is also a photo taken in Homer, north of Churchill. So latitude can be deceiving in terms of these definitions. So how do we do it? How do we come up with a clear definition? Well, there are a couple different ways to define the Arctic. There is what we just talked about, the latitude. There's something called tree line. We know the word tundra. That means treeless, literally an area that has no trees. Churchill, Manitoba, which many of you are quite familiar with, especially if you've been watching these. Churchill, Manitoba has areas that are right on the border of where there are trees. So there's areas that look like the tundra, or what is sometimes referred to as the land of the little sticks. And then there's the boreal forest. So the tree line can be one way to define the Arctic. Anything above the tree line where there's no trees, where there's tundra, would be considered the Arctic. Anything below that would be not. However, there are places, for example, in Norway, that are way far above the Arctic Circle that are forested. So that definition falls short as well. Then we have the isotherm. This is the definition by temperature. This would be saying that you have about a 50-degree Fahrenheit average in the summer and then certain cold temperatures in the winter. I don't know if any of you have been to Churchill during the summer months, but it can get to be about 70, maybe 75 even degrees Fahrenheit during the summer. And you got polar bears there. So is that the Arctic? What do you say? I have come to believe that the best definition of strict Arctic would be where there are polar bears. Nonetheless, if we want to start to talk about living in the north, which is a good general way to understand a lot of these places, we're just going to talk about where we have very short days in the winter and very long days in the summer. We're going to talk about a place where you have so many pairs of boots like this around that they become planters because they are an essential part of life. So what is it? What is winter solstice? We're getting very close to this, the shortest day of the year. And this is the day when the Earth is tilted in such a way that if you were above that Arctic Circle, there would be no hours of sunlight. Opposite, in the summer, June 21, roughly, it turns out there's a little bit of wiggle room in that, Then around June 20 or 21, you would have no hours of darkness, okay? So here in Homer today, again, 59 degrees. It is 9:55 a.m. when we finally had our sunrise, and at 4:04 p.m., the sun will set. So we managed to squeak out about 6 hours of daylight today. That's not very long, it turns out. And yes, we do feel it. I took this photograph this morning at 9 a.m. So it was still quite dark as I was preparing my webinar. And we're going to talk now about what it's like to get through that. My son took this picture last night. We learned about that geomagnetic activity, and he was getting ready to practice in case the lights came out. This was a 30-second exposure. Reason I wanted to show you this picture, because I'm proud of my son, but also because that's the kind of thing you gotta do to get through the long winter. You gotta go do fun stuff. You gotta get outside even when it's cold. Now, the way you get through the winter is to get outside and to prepare. And that doesn't happen during the winter months. That happens during the summer. You also have to be very aware of what is on the ground with you. You will notice that this bear is not located in the wilderness. There are very much so human things around this bear. This is something that we need to remain aware of here in Alaska at all times. So we need to be keenly aware of this. Beautiful, gorgeous bear on a lawn, right? You can see this is very much so a green grass in front of this bear. So if you want to live in Homer, Alaska, regardless of the time of year, I highly recommend you have a dog. This is a key thing. One of the things that I thought as I was preparing for this, what is it about living here that is different? What do I have to be prepared for or ready for? And that's for things that might not be normal when I lived in Michigan to just be normal. And that is a moose walking towards the drive-through at McDonald's. This becomes a normal way of life for us. I also have to think about food. Everything that lives in the subarctic or the Arctic has to prepare for food. It isn't always ever present in the winter, so you've got to be ready for it. Now, this was a fox that on one of my Churchill trips showed off this hare. We had gone into the forest with a group. I do this little thing with my group where I show them that there are berries that are actually underneath the snow, preserved quite beautifully in the winter. So I was, as could be found often, on my knees, digging in the snow, showing my group that there were berries. Out came this fox to see what I was doing, padded over to us, looked. I kind of think he said, uh-oh, someone else is digging things up in this area. So he walked away quickly, went to get this hare that he clearly had already hunted, came and showed it to us, like, you might have berries, but I've got this hare, and then went to trot off. We jumped in the van, followed it, and then it went to bury it in another location. So taking care of your winter food is not something that only humans have to do during these winter months. This is from Slavbard. I think I got it right that time. It's not just in Alaska that we are preparing and prepping food during the summer months. These are dried fish skins that I saw hanging when I was there visiting. And this is what our produce shelves looked like last week. And this is not because of COVID. This is not scarcity shopping. I'm going to give you a minute to think of why our shelves might look this way. The roads were really icy and the truck just couldn't get down. So when I sent my husband to the store, it was awesome of him to go. I said, we really need some more veggies. And he sent me these photos and said, this is what they got. What do you want? Luckily, we like a lot of the things in this picture. but it is not always the same that you might find in the lower 48 with bountiful shelves of veggies and you know, all the produce that you may want. So sometimes we get packages like this that might seem like not that big of a deal to someone else. My mom sent us sweet corn from the lower 48, which up here would be about $1 to $2 an ear, and down there, I'm sure did not cost that much. This is also her homemade salsa, which is an extra special treat. So a box like this is a huge deal to my kids, right? Because they're like, oh my God, it's the good corn. It can be very exciting. Now, we're going to talk about hunting and gathering here for a little bit. So if this is a subject that makes you uncomfortable, I just want to warn you, there's some photos coming that are of animals and not just of loving to look at animals. It's also a subject that makes me uncomfortable on a regular basis. It's a constant family discussion. Is this animal something we're going to fully use? Is this protein we're going to eat all the way? And I will tell you, this halibut that my son caught is what we eat 2, 3 times a week. This is feeding our family for the winter. So it's not just a proud moment. Of course, he was incredibly proud and he loved catching it. I think it ended up being about an 80-pound halibut. So he just said from the other room, it was 100 pounds. It's also a proud moment for his father, right? But it's something that we as a family work together to process. We've got salmon here that we're processing, and that is food that we're going to be putting up for the winter. That's our protein. We've got a big freezer on the back porch, and that deep freeze is what's going to get us through the winter months. It's not just the food though, and don't worry, we're not going to eat these sandhill cranes. I just put this in here so that you have something beautiful to look at. Because right while we're working on those fish or we're taking a minute to collect other food, we also have incredible animals around us that we get to stop and photograph and enjoy. My kids love taking these photos of these birds that were just hanging out in our cul-de-sac. And this is in the Ski-Lac Wilderness area. We went to go look for mushrooms this summer. Also a yummy food source that we wanted to make sure we gathered up before winter came. Here's the morels that we found. And then raspberries. We've got a raspberry patch in the backyard. We made sorbet from that. My husband got the award for that sorbet. Gathering that up so we make sure we've got that loaded into the freezer so we can make smoothies during the winter and have a nice source of vitamin C. I'm always impressed that right around fall when school is starting, that's right when we are getting tons of vitamin C and tons of vitamin D from the salmon, all of the things we need to get our immune system going and ready for the fall. Right as this is happening in the summer, we have these little moose coming down to visit us and check things out. So lots of joy while we're doing the work of getting prepared for the winter. And this wasn't the most welcome visitor, I have to say. Of course, the boat is on the car here. This is my husband's way of getting the boat down to the water. And this eagle, I'm sure the talons on the boat is not something my husband wanted to see, but we were pretty excited to have an eagle just right there in the yard. So that was pretty cool. Now, the chicken coop was a welcome feature that we added this year, and we ended up getting about 6 to 7 eggs every single day. So that's another addition of protein that we don't have to go to the grocery store for, which is awesome. I wanted to also show you this photo because of the pushki, that plant that is right in the front of this photo. And you can see Taiga, that's our lab there. The pushki is a phytophototrophic plant. And what that means is that if you rub up against that plant, then go into the sunlight, you could get a little bit of a burn. And so you need to be very careful as you're moving through the Alaska forest that you're not going to rub up against this. Don't worry, when you come to visit, if I'm your guide or if you have another one, we're going to help you figure out which one the pushki is. They're huge, broad leaves, so they're pretty easy to spot. Now, all of this food that we gather, you have to prepare, right? You can't just catch it and throw it in the freezer. You've got to make sure you get it all prepped up. So here we are doing some of that work. And we had a confused chicken. We're grateful for him, but this one didn't quite catch where the nesting box was. But sometimes we get very excited because we can make an entire meal from food, or almost an entire meal. We didn't make the rice here, but we can make an entire meal from food that we gathered or caught ourselves. And that's one of the most exciting things. That's a really fun, sort of proud Alaskan moment that we get to have. This was from a hare that my son managed to trap. And I think he's got a little bit of that in his bones. Of course, some of you've heard the stories about my husband being a trapper in Churchill way back in the day. So this was from that. Now this one I won't say on long, but that is a caribou hide that my son and daughter were helping to prepare. And that is something that we hunted this year. My son and my husband went to hunt caribou, and that has provided us with our red meat for the winter. It's been a phenomenal resource because we have not had to buy any cow. Now, if you think about that, that's pretty cool, because if you can imagine, cow coming from the lower 48 would have quite the carbon footprint. So it's been fun. It was hard to learn how to cook at first, honestly, but I'm getting there. My skills are kind of improving. Kind of fun to put on Facebook sometimes. Who's got some recipes from my fellow boreal chefs? And then, of course, there's the garden. And the garden is something I must admit I'm not amazing at. I am working on it. We've got broccoli and kale. Those things grow here easily. You could grow kale until the caribou come home. But some of the other things are pretty hard. So a lot of people here have high tunnels, which is like a greenhouse Quonset hut combination sort of thing. And those produce an enormous amount of food and make it much easier. We do not have a high tunnel, so we're working on those kind of systems. We do a lot of kale. That's pretty good. And we love kale, so that's okay. And lettuce, broccoli. But to be honest, I struggle with the carrots. Other Alaskans, they got carrots coming out their ears, but I have not succeeded at that one. So if there's Alaskans listening and you have carrot tips for me, please let me know. Now, when you're living in a small town, Homer, Alaska has about 5,000 people in it, and we are at the end of the road, which means that you're not going to come through here. You're coming here for a reason. There's no box stores here. So you can't go to a Walmart without driving about an hour and a half up the road, sometimes not so awesome winter roads this time of year. And so we do have a very tight-knit community. And every year, this year it had to be virtual, but every year in the fall, we do have a celebration that an artist here in town throws, and it's called Burning Basket. And she builds this beautiful basket that other people from the town help build, and everyone can kind of put their sentiments and wishes for the year. This particular year, the theme was grow, and then it gets lit on fire. And this happens around September, so right around equinox. And it kind of welcomes in the winter, and it's a real community event. And those sort of things become really important when you're looking at making it through a long, dark winter. One of the things that you have to learn to love is light. The highlights and the lowlights become really important. You also have to remember to go to bed during the summer. That can be really hard. Sometimes around solstice, especially in the summer, if we've got like an 8 o'clock meeting at work, I have to work really hard to remember to go to sleep the night before, because it's so tempting to go have a bonfire on the beach at like midnight. But seasonality helps. You know, these Christmas time or whatever holiday it is you're celebrating, and remembering those sorts of things, those are the kind of things that help make the winter easier. Any kind of celebration, there's reasons we have these festivities during the winter. And of course, remembering to get out and do fun things. Skiing, we do a lot of cross-country skiing here. This is, of course, back over to Churchill, and any kind of things like curling or getting together with people and trying to find ways to be active and involved with your community is absolutely key to having the winter months be healthy instead of isolating. My dog was really into this craft activity. Don't worry, she didn't get hurt in the making of this craft or this photography. But this was, we were making beeswax. We did beeswax on fabric so that we could make kind of like saran wrap, right? So just making things can also be a really healthy way to enjoy the winter months. And we'll talk a little bit more about that next week as well. And then for me, this isn't a great photo. I had my cell phone out and I was driving literally. So I parked my car and quickly took a photo. It's while the kids were doing some ice skating, but getting out and doing things like that. And then of course, the magic lamp. This is called a happy lamp, or some people call it the sad lamp for seasonal affective disorder. You don't really have to have a disorder here in Alaska to need one of these. The naturopath will say, or even the doctor, an MD would say, you start using it actually in August in order to set your clock right. Because one of the things that can happen when the sun doesn't rise until 10 and it sets again at 4 is I'll accidentally tell my kids that they need to start getting ready for bed at like 5:30. I'll go into their room and say something like, hey, you know, I think maybe we need to start turning the lights off, or are you getting ready for it? And they'll be like, Mom, it's 5:30. We don't have to get ready for bed yet. But you can get a little bit confused when it's so dark, your clock just gets off. So you have to kind of pay attention to some things. And doing something like having the bright light that is on early in the morning at the same time every day sets your internal clock so that you're not getting confused by what Mother Nature's doing out there. This is a picture taken a few years back from the Aurora Fest that they have in Churchill. And this is, again, the community getting out, doing healthy stuff together, and making sure that the kids are having a good time and enjoying even the dark winter months. This was taken in February. Vitamin D. I am by no means suggesting that these brands are a thing, but vitamin D, even long before COVID or anything like that, is critically important. In fact, I think it's even part of, like, the legislators here have it as part of our system. It's a really, really important that you get enough vitamin D when your clock is off, because we can't get enough of it just by going outside, even in the summertime, because of the relationship of the sun to where we are on the planet. Ice skating. This was taken just a few weeks back. Again, sorry for the quality, but it was on my cell phone. Getting out and ice skating is absolutely a blast for the kids. Getting out and cross-country skiing and sledding. All kinds of ways to have good adventures, and that's what can make it healthy. The sun finally did come up this morning, so this was taken around 10 o'clock right before I did the webinar. But I will say, for me, one of the best ways to survive the Alaskan winter is to get on a plane and go to Baja and watch the whales. I have to admit that. So with that, Kendall, I'll hand it over to you, and people can ask as many questions as they'd like about living in the north during the winter.
Great, thank you, Annie. I just want to remind folks, if you have questions for Annie, you can submit those in your control panel under the questions field. Okay, first question for you is, what was the toughest lifestyle adjustment for you, or biggest surprise in moving to Alaska?
When we first moved here, there was no Amazon. So you couldn't, it wasn't really tough, I guess. Like, it's not like it wasn't hard, but it was definitely different. You couldn't get things. So it was a really big deal if you needed really sometimes very basic things, and especially having young children, it was a thing sometimes just to get some basic stuff. However, what I love is that it is totally normal in this community, and not like, I don't know, when I was growing up, if you were like the hand-me-down kid, that maybe wasn't like the coolest kid, right? But in this town, there's almost like a point of pride if you are like, get hand-me-downs from one of the cool kids, because everyone is going to get hand-me-downs, because there's like 2 shops in town. So you quickly realize, like, you need to find your hand-me-down families. And we got very lucky. I'm so grateful. Our hand-me-down families happened to own one of the shops in town. Thank you, Leslie Mastic and Homer Jeans. So my girls were and my son were spoiled in the hand-me-down department. So that was hard at first to just like, I need these basic things. And I, you know, it's a skill you develop for how to get them here. So that was hard. The light is so hard. You have to learn. I didn't know vitamin D. I didn't know cross country. You know, I used to cross country ski as a kid, but I didn't know you gotta get out. You have to start that lamp in August. You have to take the vitamin D. You have to do those things. And if you don't, it can get really hard. Oh, and you have to get your food ready because financially, this is a big question. I feel like I could answer this for a long time. Financially, if you don't get those things ready, it's going to be tough to handle the grocery bill. So I would say that might have been the hardest, is to learn how to have those things ready so that you can handle the finances of winter groceries. That was it. Thanks for listening to my long answer.
And what's your favorite season in Alaska and why?
Jokingly, I want to say the season where I leave and go to Baja, but it's not true. You know, summer is my favorite season. I'm a summer person through and through. But I have to say, like right now it's snowing outside and it's like the most classic, you know, dreaming of a white Christmas kind of fluffy snow, and it's absolutely beautiful. So I do love the look of that, but I am a summer person. I mean, we've got whales, we've got bears, we've got going for walks, and so summer, berries and fishing, and it's just this like bursting at the seams with life kind of place. You really do have to kind of check in on your neighbors, like, are you sleeping? Because when it doesn't get dark, right, you can sort of forget that your workday ended, and then you're going to go garden, and then you're going to go out on the boat, and then you're going to maybe go to the beach, and you're like, oh, it's 1 a.m. We should probably put the kids to bed. So summer.
What's your average snowfall in the winter?
You know, it's interesting. We live in a maritime climate here, and I live quite close. I can see the water from my house. I don't live on the beach or anything like that, but I have a peekaboo view. I live at, I think, just under 300 feet elevation. I might have that a little off. So right where I live, it's not a ton of accumulation, but if I were to just drive those pictures I showed you of my kids skiing, that's just like a mile or so up in elevation, not even that much, and not even anywhere near that much in elevation, just a mile or so up the hill. And then there's a ton of snow. So to say overall, it varies greatly depending on how close you are to the water. Yeah, tune in next week and maybe I'll have an actual number for you on that. It also varies greatly year to year, I think. Right now, I would say we've got like about 6 inches of snow out there, and we're very happy that it's snow, because a lot of times we can have weather that lingers around 33 degrees. So we can have that like icy, rainy, almost like northern Seattle weather because of the maritime. But then if you drive up the hill, there would be snow there.
Right. What are the main types of industries to work in there?
Well, in the state, the industries would be oil, tourism, conservation, you know, fisheries management, that kind of thing. Mining, I guess that would go back to oil. Fisheries, of course, is huge. And then anything that's like service related. I call those self-perpetuating jobs. I'm sure there's a, you know, much more elegant term for that, but like hospitals, teaching, grocery, all of that sort of thing. So yeah, tourism is huge here. Oil is huge. Fisheries are huge.
How hard is it? A few people are interested in this, excuse me, to get medical care there.
There's a few things to that. I want to say it's really hard and it's really easy. So there's a couple things. We had, I don't want this to sound political at all, so apologies, because I'm not meaning to go there. we have in our state, because of oil, we have something called the permanent fund dividend, which means that each person in our state gets a check. So right now, roughly, it's been about $1,000 per person per year. There's been years back when it's been more than that. If you look into Norway, they have a somewhat similar system as well. We also don't have income tax. There's a lot that you could get into with that, but I'll just say that when we moved here, what was very interesting, and this was a very long time ago, in terms of current healthcare things, they had something called, and they still do, Denali Kid Care, which means that they basically have health care, like Medicaid, for Alaskan kids. So that was really interesting and new to us, that like there's sort of this like state health care. I presume that came about, and I'm not speaking from an educated position on this, but I presume that came about sort of from that oil money, would be my guesstimate, educated guesstimate. So that made it easier in some ways to get health care. Also, sometimes really amazing doctors want to come to Alaska. So sometimes we have these phenomenal doctors that come here, and you're like, wow, look at this guy's like, you know, credentials. He's amazing. And he just wanted, or she just wanted to come to Alaska. I live on the road system, and I live in a relatively big town. I know that sounds really crazy if you think about where probably most of you that are listening, the size of the towns that you live in, but I don't live in a village, and I don't live off the road system. Those kinds of places would be incredibly difficult to get good healthcare because you'd have to fly for anything. We at least have a hospital here in Homer. Like we've got, you know, you could get a CAT scan, you could get a MRI, all of those kinds of things. And we have great doctors here in Homer. Anchorage also has some good medicine. At the same time, I happen to have 2 kids who've had some healthcare issues that couldn't be handled in the state, and we just went to Seattle when it got more complicated. So hope that answers that.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a ton of curiosity about your chickens. So we're gonna talk about your chickens a little bit.
Okay, let's talk about those chickens.
People want to know, you know, what their living situation is like, especially in the winter, and do they lay year round? And if you want to just, I guess, elaborate on their lives a little bit.
Just talk about my chickens.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're pretty new to having chickens. This is our first winter having chickens, and we are definitely going off of advice of our fellow Alaskans. At first, we thought they were going to have like a heater and just all kinds of things, and everyone was like, no, you don't need those things. You need to have a good home, and you need to have like hay and, you know, good food and all of that. And we were like, really? Like, won't they need like a heat lamp, and won't they need, and they're like, nope, you really don't. So that's what we're doing for now, and watching them closely. They have a good home. We keep hay and sawdust in their coop place. And we feed them, mostly we feed them, I guess what people would say is slop or compost. So we're doing that technique plus some grain. And that's a technique of food that is based on basically a couple things. One, then we don't waste food. And 2, what happens is their food, then what they don't eat, ends up creating a really great compost layer. And then they end up creating kind of their own food in a way. There gets to be a biota thing happening, and so that they're essentially making food. So it's a very low budget, high energy way to feed your chickens. Some days we're getting like 6 or 7 eggs. In the fall time, we had days when we were getting even more than that, which was amazing. They are slowing down a little bit now as it's getting a little colder, and that's what we expected. We were told that would happen, that during the coldest months, they would slow down and maybe like 3 or 4. We have 6 chickens. They are red stars and black stars, I believe. I think they're really mutts. We got them from somewhere here, and we didn't know if they were all going to be hens, because again, we like just picked them out, and it's very hard to sex chickens, it turns out. So we didn't know if they were all going to be hens, but we got really lucky, and we do have all hens, so that was cool. And I love them. They actually satisfied my need to watch animals this summer, because normally my job is to go hang out with you all and watch animals and like talk about it, right, and learn from these animals. And I was like starving for whales and bears to like learn about their behavior and talk about it. And my kids were like, Mom needs to go hang out with chickens. And I would just go sit down there, and I was in awe of them. Like, Bruce is doing this and Chuck is doing that, and I love them. I highly recommend chickens for anyone who wants daily chores.
There's a few people who are curious about any threats to the chickens from wildlife like foxes.
Yeah, so actually it's been, okay, we have to have a net over, so there's the roof on their coop, and then we have to have a net over just their open area. And we definitely, that's where the dog comes into play too, because it would be eagles and falcons that we would be most worried about. I do not mean this to sound as kind of sarcastic as it's going to sound. So please, if you have a small dog, I don't mean to sound disrespectful, but like people here in town have to watch their small dogs because of eagles. They get carried off. So we definitely have to watch the chickens. For that, we've just got a net over top. And then in the summertime, we can like let them out into the lawn, into the yard more, and they can just kind of free range. And I think having the dog around for that is good. We also have to watch moose from, not this time of year as much, but in the summer, the moose just come into the yard, as you saw in those photos. And so we have to make sure that they're not like, they don't plow into the coop, just because they're not the sharpest tool. So sometimes they might just kind of like walk into our fence area. It wouldn't be to get at anything. It would just be because they run into something. And then we did saw a weasel in the neighborhood, but again, dog comes in handy for just kind of barking in that sense.
Oh, yeah. There's quite a bit of curiosity about how winter events in Homer and just life in general is being affected by COVID right now.
Our family for the last, I think it might be 10 years, but I might be wrong on that number. It could be 9 years, has been involved every winter in the Nutcracker. So our town puts on the most awesome, quirky, beautiful Nutcracker. And if you ever want to come somewhere in the winter just to see a northern exposure type version, but yet very talented and so much work goes into it for months, our town puts on this Nutcracker. I mean, we have people come from all over, like drive down from Anchorage and Fairbanks to come and see this. We also have like a very cool, like a Nutcracker fair that happens around it where people sell, local art and all of that kind of stuff. And that's like your Christmas presents. So that we couldn't do that this year. There is going to be a virtual one. So the dancers are preparing. It didn't work out for our family this year to be involved in it, but other dancers are preparing the virtual version. So I'm very excited to see that. So that was hard for the first time to not be involved in it. Don't tell the kids, but my husband, I think, is very relieved. It's a very big commitment. There's other things too that, I think are really hard. Luckily, cross-country skiing is central to our winter culture here, and that's still happening and can happen because you're just out on the trails. So that's there. We often have a winter parade in February. I don't know that will happen. We'll see. The library, I think, is a big thing. We have like readings and whatnot, and we often have writing courses. So I think there's a lot of things, that people just aren't getting together for. I mean, I jokingly call it potluck season, because you sort of get through this winter like one potluck at a time, and we're not doing that. But also we do tend to get outside. So I think that people can hopefully satisfy some of that need for socialness to go outside. Alaskans don't believe there's bad weather. We just believe there's bad gear. So we don't get quite as stopped by snow or bad weather.
Hmm. There's some curiosity about what farmers markets are like.
The best, my favorite. I love it. I love it. I sometimes have to balance my joy for spending the weekend camping with not wanting to miss the farmers market. Because they're just absolutely wonderful. And that was one of the hardest things this summer. Luckily, it didn't get canceled. They managed it beautifully. We wore masks. We they had these really cool systems of not touching money, and it was brilliant. But since I haven't figured out the carrots, I got to go to the market. So, yeah, I mean, they're incredible. They're absolutely one of my favorite places. I used to, before I went back to guiding, I used to sell things at the market. I painted pots. I don't know if I have one close to me, but I used to paint pots and put plants in it, because one of the things I noticed when I moved here is it was hard to buy house plants. I used to have, when I lived in Michigan, I had abundant amount of house plants, and like they were really hard to find here and very, very expensive. I was like, I'm not going to spend $75 on a house plant. So I would get clippings from friends in the winter and then paint pots and then grow them, and then sell them at the farmer's market when I had little babies. That hold my little babies and sell them little plants at the farmer's market. It was fun.
So someone just asked if there are any traditional holidays celebrated by the native population in Alaska.
I am sure that there are. Homer is an interesting place. So the name Kachemak Bay, which is the bay that Homer is on, means smoky bay. And there's naturally occurring coal on the bay here. Like people literally go to the beach, get coal, and warm their house with it. We used to do that before we got a new furnace. It was glorious. Thanks, Mom and Dad, for helping with that. But people literally can go and get coal. So the indigenous people would come to Kachemak Bay, to Smoky Bay, and they named it that because they would keep a fire going on the beach all year long. I have seen how this works. I have friends who live down the bay, and we built a fire on the beach in May, coal area, put the fire out in what we thought was very responsibly and what would by any other outdoor fire management standards be responsible. Luckily, it was on the beach, so we were not near a forest, right? We went back in September, went to build a fire in the same area, and the coals were still there. So, and that's because there was coal way underneath, way down, that had just been smoldering. And that's what happens with Smoky Bay. So that's what the first people in this area would do, is they would maybe go travel nomadically around and come here for that. But there wasn't necessarily, from what I have learned, a settlement right in this particular spot. There's camps like villages across the bay and across the inlet. So I don't personally experience the celebration of those holidays here, but they are definitely around. Now, the other big story with that is that missionaries came. And so a lot of the culture was mixed. I am planning a webinar, and I don't want to say what the date will be because it's going to take some planning, with a writer who's much more intimately familiar with this question. So I'm going to leave the information there and give you a little bit of a teaser and say, let's talk a lot more about that with that upcoming webinar.
Nice, thank you. Okay, yeah. So the last question we'll end on today is, there's a few people who they want to be reminded of why did you move to Alaska, and Homer in particular, and when did you move there?
Is that my mom asking that question? Why did you go,
honey?
Moving back. Yeah. So my husband and I met in Churchill, even though he's from Ohio and I'm from Michigan. We met in Churchill, and we were guiding there. He worked at a lodge and I was guiding polar bear trips. But he was American. So we tried living in Michigan for a little bit, bearless, whaleless Michigan. I love Michigan. It's a phenomenal state, but there's no bears or whales. And so we said, all right, well, let's go to Alaska for like a summer. And we found a lodge to work at. And we were just going to come for a summer. And then we fell in love. We were already in love with each other, but we fell in love with this place. And especially Homer, we got here and it was like really clear that this would be a phenomenal community to raise our children in. That was the hook, really, was like, this is a place where people care about the community and the children in this community. It's an overeducated community. There's people who live here just because they want to live here, like PhD people who are like, I'm going to live here and I might be a carpenter, but I just love living here. And it's just a phenomenal community of people who care about each other deeply. And we could see that right when we moved here. So that's what got me. And I have wondered if I should leave many times because it is hard. But that's what keeps me. That's what keeps me here. And the bears and the whales.
Well, it's pretty unique, I have to say, in this day and age. So it sounds delightful. But all right, I'm going to call it there with questions, and I'll hand it back over to you for closing comments.
Well, thank you, everybody, so much for joining me for this time and being curious about this different way of living. I think, as Kendall said, it is different and unique, and I think the more we can learn from each other about different ways of living, the better we all are. So I appreciate you taking that time, and I cannot wait to be on a trip with you so I can learn about your way of life and how you're living and doing. So also, I can't wait for you to come to Alaska so you can experience it firsthand. Thanks so much for joining me. And next week, we're going to have a really cool webinar on what to do with all this holiday stuff that's coming our way, all the waste and all the paper and boxes. So kind of different than what I normally do, but I think it's going to be a lot of fun. So join me for that one and have a great day. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Annie. It was so fun to learn about the way of life up there. And I appreciate you taking the time to present for us today. And I can't wait to get to Alaska too. And my thanks as well. I know, I can't wait. It's on my list. It's on the top of my list.
Okay, thank you, Kendall.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. We did record today's presentation, so we'll have a replay available on our website soon. And with that, I'll conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.
All right, bye.